November's election will be about the economy, but make no mistake, American energy or the lack thereof is a big part of it. And when I say energy, I don't mean that hopey, changey, vibey crap. I mean energy production. Kamala needs to win Pennsylvania, so her campaign wants you to believe she's not a climate change cultist, but we have the tapes.
Will you commit to implementing a federal ban on fracking your first day in office, adding the United States to the list of countries who have banned this devastating practice?
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So, yeah. So again, back to the United States Congress, here's my point. If they fail to act as President of the United States, I am prepared to get rid of the filibuster to pass a Green New Deal. Because we have to act.
Uh-oh, 2019 Kamala strikes again. She's a fraud and a disaster for American energy production and independence, but there's more than an election case for fossil fuels. There's also a moral case, and here to break that down and debunk the climate cult is energy expert and author of several fantastic books, but his newest is Fossil Future, Alex Epstein. So, Alex, there's a lot of discussion right now about energy independence, about climate change, all the things that are, our typical discussions come election time. But you've done such an excellent job of debunking a lot of the fear mongering on the left. What would you say is the number one lie they are telling ahead of November?
It's hard to pick one. I'm going to pick two. So one is that rising CO2 levels, so CO2 emissions, basically what those lead to over time, that is a climate crisis or a climate emergency that requires the rapid elimination of fossil fuels. And unfortunately, no candidate has really fully refuted this in the debates. Obviously, Trump and Vance are much less sympathetic to that narrative, but it's just a fact that human beings are getting safer and safer from climate, and fossil fuels are a big reason why. They've just made us incredibly resilient to climate, to the point where, the temperature going up by 1 degree Celsius 2 degrees Fahrenheit just isn't that big a deal. And people don't seem to be able to wrap their mind around we can have climate impact or climate change and not climate crisis. In fact, we're having an increase in climate livability. So that's number one. And then number two is that attempting to rapidly reduce or eliminate fossil fuels won't lead to huge problems. And in fact, it's leading to enormous problems already, even though globally we haven't even reduced the supply of fossil fuels. Just by slowing the growth, we've created huge problems. And number one, Americans should be focused on, and the debates have not talked about this, which is criminal, is the grid. The grid is in an absolute catastrophe state right now. It's clearly related to anti-fossil fuel policies. We have a dramatic increase in demand in the pipeline based on AI data centers, and then also forced EVs. And that we should be talking about this all the time because we already have record shortages right now at today's demand levels. This administration is trying to shut down more reliable power plants, shut down all the coal plants, and prevent new natural gas plants from replacing them. And we need way more electricity. Like, this is the number one energy issue everyone should be talking about, and almost nobody is.
You're right about that. And a few things I want to talk to you about. But to your last point, every time this is discussed, whether it be a Democrat pundit or on the debate stage, we just hear the Kamala team, the Biden team say, oh, we have the most natural gas, we have more leases, we're producing more than ever. And they really rely on that talking point to kind of dismiss all of the real concerns about American energy production and sustainability when it comes to production, when it comes to our supply and demand. So when you hear them say that, what would be your response to that as somebody who obviously knows this far better than your average American?
So two things. One, I said this at a hearing recently. This is obviously in spite of you, not because of you. Joe Biden ran on, I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuel. He didn't run on, I guarantee you we're going to have record oil production. So his administration has taken many measures to reduce oil and gas production, to stop coal, to destroy our grid. And many opponents have heroically resisted him. So they've sued him over leasing bans. They've stopped a lot of his worst stuff. And there was a lot of good activity in the investment pipeline coming into this administration. So we are having record oil production. We'd probably have more if we had better policies. But but he's clearly trying to stop it. So it's a totally disingenuous point. And the second point here is, so it's obviously in spite of them. That's point number one. Point number two is they obviously don't believe there's a climate crisis. Because what are they saying? They're saying we're increasing the existential threat, right? We're proud of increasing the oil production. That's an existential threat. So it's just pure politics.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really frustrating for the American people, especially those that are struggling to afford the fossil fuels that they need, to hear the administration say climate change is our biggest threat and it's apocalyptic. I mean, I think that even when you hear it on the debate stage, it to me, it's a place of privilege to talk about climate change when people are actually struggling, especially in the aftermath of things like Hurricane Helene. So that was brought up in the VP debate. Oh, we're seeing this catastrophic weather. Obviously, things are getting worse because of climate change. Every time we have a natural disaster or an event, it's always pushed back to the climate apocalypse. When you hear this and when you see the devastation from things like Hurricane Helene, what would you tell folks that want to believe that this is caused by human activity and climate change?
Well, I'd say you just have to look at the trends of climate deaths and climate damage. And the trend is that climate deaths are way down and climate damage isn't up, adjusted for growth, despite the fact, we have a lot more infrastructure that can be destroyed. So obviously in a place like Miami, you're going to have more destroyed than you would 100 years ago because there's a lot more wealth to destroy. But we're not losing wealth because of climate. And in fact, we've saved a lot of lives. The death rate from climate disasters is down by a factor of 50 over the last 100 years. So anyone who is just taking one incident that's a tragedy and then blaming it on something when they're ignoring the fact that the trend is the opposite is either ignorant or they're being disingenuous. And if I were Republicans, I wouldn't just be conceding, oh, it's such weird weather, there's so many problems. Like, we're not actually having more problems related to weather. We're having fewer problems related to weather. And it's because we're so resilient, and fossil fuels are a huge part of that. And we just need to wake up to this reality. It's not the 1700s. 1700s were a climate emergency. We didn't know how to deal with climate. Now we're advanced and we pretend that we're afraid of the weather. So the hurricane would have been far worse had it not been for fossil fuels.
Also, when we're talking about some of these alternatives, we talk about the EV mandate. I want to get a little bit more into depth into that. But I couldn't help thinking in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, when people are struggling with connectivity, they're struggling to get out of their homes, they need to be rescued. I think about all these things, and I think about the people that are lucky enough to be able to get out of their homes that are not, filled with water and just being able to evacuate. And I think, boy, this would be a bad time to only have an electric vehicle, because where are you going to plug it in? And how are you going to get out? And how far are you going to be able to go before your electric vehicle fails? So when I look at this, catastrophe that is Hurricane Helene, I'm thinking, thank God for fossil fuels, because if not for fossil fuels, these people would be in a really tight spot. And those people that only have an electric vehicle, boy, they're going to be in a tough position with that electric vehicle. And we know that these EV mandates, to me, they're arbitrary deadlines for when we need these EV mandates. But can you speak to that a little bit? A lot of people, even on the Republican side, that they say that it would be ideal to have electric vehicles, even though they don't believe in mandates. But I'm guessing that you push back against that narrative wholeheartedly, that it's not an ideal. And if it's not, then why?
So, well, it's clearly not an ideal to the people who matter, which are American citizens who should be free to judge what kind of car they want to drive. And the point you brought up is a great point, that a liquid fueled vehicle that you can fill up really quickly at a station, you can store liquid fuel really easily, unlike you can't store electricity nearly that easily. That has a lot more flexibility in the case of disaster. And that's one of the many, many reasons why traditional internal combustion engine vehicles are more cost effective than electric vehicles or battery vehicles in particular. So cost effective means both. It means that it's lower cost and it's more effective. And the reason most people choose gasoline cars is not just the cost is better, but that they can do more things. So it can usually hold more people, have more range, not have range anxiety. So I'm all for EVs solving these problems or trying to solve these problems, or people coming up with another way of powering a car. But the fact is that EVs are just not nearly as good as gasoline vehicles right now. And the dependence you mentioned is a problem with any grid, but with a grid where we're artificially restricting the supply of reliable electricity, having more and more shortages, you could have a mass death event if you have people dependent on EVs with a grid that is strapped for electricity. Like, you do not want to go through that. I mean, look at what happened in Texas. Fortunately, they weren't all dependent on EVs. Even during Winter Storm Uri, it was a total catastrophe. But imagine they have all EVs, the grid crashes. What do you do?
Right. Well, I think about that in the case of fires in California. We know California is so gung-ho about their EV mandate. I'm thinking people that are trying to get out. What happens if the fire is coming, you're trying to get out, your vehicle's not charged, you have no way to power up, trying to get out of harm's way? I mean, that would be a disaster, something I wouldn't want to put myself through. And I've said it before, but I really think that we need to be honest about it. People that drive electric vehicles, people that drive their Teslas, they might love their Teslas, but everybody that I know that has a Tesla or has one of these cyber trucks or electric vehicles, they're wealthy people who can also afford a gas-powered vehicle, and their Tesla or whatever is like their little hobby vehicle. But if they really needed something, they always have a backup in the garage. But people that are not wealthy, that can't afford a Tesla, that are driving, a little electric vehicle that they can afford, I mean, it seems like quite the plight to put on these people, especially if you're going to mandate it at a federal level. What do you see this being like if a Kamala Harris were to be elected and she pushes a Green New Deal initiative? What do you think it's going to do to lower income folks?
I mean, I was testifying with a woman named Donna Jackson a couple of weeks ago, and she made a lot of really good points about this at this House Budget Committee hearing. And one of them was just for lower income workers, how much they depend on transportation for their livelihood. Either at their current job, they need to usually travel more than a typical person does, or for some, having a car is the key to getting a job. And so anything you do to increase the cost of transportation means it puts it out of reach for people, which means that it is depriving them of economic opportunity. We've already done this with insane fuel economy standards that make no sense. We've already made cars way, way, way too expensive, even gasoline cars. So by putting EVs on people, which have all of these limitations on the benefit side and then more problems on the cost side, it's just saying, screw you, to people with less money, and you're depriving them of opportunity. In addition to, as you mentioned, possibly causing a catastrophe in the event of, a bad weather event.
And some folks would say, well, that's why the government needs to further subsidize electric vehicles. And that's always the go-to talking point. Well, if the government just subsidizes it more, it'll be more affordable for folks. What do you say to that talking point?
Yeah, then I mean that's why we have so much inflation, because they think that you subsidize things for free. So when you subsidize things, that's just increasing the debt, which increases inflation in one way or another. So and by the way, if you actually wanted to help somebody with a subsidy, why don't you subsidize the good thing that's convenient to them and actually make it cheaper, instead of subsidizing the super expensive, inconvenient thing and making it a little bit less expensive and it's still inconvenient. So the purpose for them of subsidizing is not to empower people with transportation. It's to just get more people on board with their political agenda. But the anti-fossil fuel political agenda is bad for everybody, rich and poor, especially poor, because it means that we're going to have scarce energy, which means that we cannot be as good a country. We can't be as competitive. The price of everything goes up, as Vance pointed out last night, and we don't have a functioning grid. So these policies are bad for everyone. And I think Democrats, I'm seeing more and more Democrats push back against this. We really need people from both parties to just get off this anti-fossil fuel net zero agenda, because we really don't want to have what's happening to Germany, let alone what happens to third world countries. Like, let's learn the lessons from them and not just crater our economy. I don't like lessons that are learned through catastrophe.
Right. Well, there's a lot of demonization, not only of fossil fuels, but you hear it, and we just heard it in California with Gavin Newsom taking on big oil, taking on fossil fuel industries. That used to be an applause line for politicians, that they were taking on big oil, and people that lobby for fossil fuels or the fossil fuel industry. Those are the bad guys. That's big corporate America. And, the little guys are the ones that are fighting for green. But I'm wondering, because you're so heavily invested in this and you see it on a daily basis, I would argue that big green is becoming comparable in size and scope and influence to big oil. And I think big green is having devastating effects, and the big green lobby, devastating effects on not only our country, but to your point, the world. What do you know about big green that the average person might not know, that thinks that these are such valiant people who simply want to save Mother Earth?
Well, I want to get away from this big language. So the big language really can easily be used to demonize success. Like, the way you become a big company is by being successful. And so big oil tends to be the most efficient form of oil. What's interesting about green is there's not much big green in the sense of being financially successful. There is, though, government dictated green. And I talk a lot about government dictated green energy. There's a huge amount of green power. And what's happened, particularly with the advent of the Inflation Reduction Act, is the government is giving away so much money, and people have no idea how much money they're giving away. I mean, they promised around 400 billion, which is already terrible, but it's looking to be 5 trillion plus over the next decade or two. So they're giving away so much money, and that means that everyone is sort of kissing up to the government, including many people in the oil and gas industry, because they're starting to get subsidies as well. So this is a really, really bad trend that we're all forced to pay for inefficient uses of energy. So here's what the government policy does of government dictated green energy. One is it subsidizes inefficient energy, which means we have to pay extra money for energy that isn't as good, often through taxes or inflation. So we don't even see it directly. So it's hidden from us. The other thing that it does is it shackles cost-effective energy, most notably fossil fuels. So it restricts fossil fuels, so they're more expensive. So we pay more by restricting what's good, and we pay more by subsidizing what's not good. And the green lobby, it's important, government dictated green is totally dependent on subsidies. So if the government stops favoring them, they go away, their livelihood go away, their cocktail parties go away, their conferences go away. So these guys are really wedded to government favors and government restrictions on their opponents.
The demand just isn't there. I mean, I'm here in Tennessee, and even our Republican governor, they invested all this taxpayer money and state money into these Ford factories for the EVs. And, they want to build this big campus for the EV manufacturing and all of this. And people just don't want an EV. People that want to drive an F-150, they don't want an EV F-150. The demand just isn't there from the customer, and they fail to understand and acknowledge what the customer actually wants. But the government money, it speaks volumes. I do think it's important, though, to talk about the election coming up and how the Democrats are willing to shape their message to try to get around maybe some of the unpopular Green New Deal policies that they have long pushed and long fought to subsidize. And when you look at Pennsylvania and how close that election is going to be, a lot of folks there understand the importance of fossil fuels. They also understand the importance to their economy of fracking. And I think we hear this word fracking, and to the average person out there, they don't even really know what it is. Could you give those folks a better understanding of what this technology is and why it's important to our economy and especially to Pennsylvanians?
Sure. I mean, the number one thing to know about fracking is that it's used in the overwhelming percentage of oil production and natural gas production. So 60% of oil production, 75% of natural gas production, more or less, uses this thing called fracking. And what fracking stands for is hydraulic fracturing. And the fracturing is what you do to rocks. So we have rocks that have oil and gas in them, but for a long time, we couldn't get the oil and gas out. But through this ingenious evolution of fracking, because fracking's been around for a long time, and what's called horizontal drilling and other technologies, we can take once useless rocks and make them into life-giving oil and gas. So it is insane and horrific that around the world, people have been lobbying to ban this and have banned it. So a lot of Europe's problems with Russia are they banned fracking throughout the continent, right? Almost everywhere in Europe banned fracking. So we discovered basically the most consequential energy technology the last 25 years, and Europe's response is to ban it. And unfortunately, Kamala Harris's initial response was, yeah, I want to ban it too. I want to copy Europe. Now, maybe after Russia invades Ukraine, people are starting to wake up, because I'll bet Europe wished they had a lot more natural gas from fracking instead of depending on it from Russia. But it's that consequential. I think the point to make about Kamala Harris and anyone else, and again, I don't take sides with parties, but if you opposed fracking, you basically were calling for the destruction of the US and the starvation of the world, because natural gas is the basis of fertilizer. We can't feed 8 billion people today without fracking, or it costs way, way more. So if you advocated something that would have been terrible for the US and murderous for the world, you should publicly apologize and explain your reasons why. You can't just say, oh, I changed my mind. And especially because she hasn't changed her mind on the fundamentals, which is that she wants to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. So as I wrote recently on one of my blogs, alexepstein.substack.com, what she's doing is she's just switching the fossil fuel process she's opposed to. So she's still saying, let's get rid of all fossil fuels more or less by 2050, but let's not do fracking first because certain voters like it. So you're going to destroy the grid first? That doesn't reassure me.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I don't think she could tell you. I don't think that she could tell you her evolution because I don't think she understands why she's against it or why she's now for it. I don't think she understands any of this. I think she goes with whatever way the wind blows, which is actually the last thing I want to ask you about, because there's a lot of folks out there that do love the environment. They want clean air. They want clean water. They love animals. They love conservation, which conservatives at our core do love conservation. It's in our very name, in our essence. But there's been a lot of discussion about some of this wind power and how it might affect wildlife, how it might affect our oceans. Can you speak to that at all? Because there has been a disturbing uptick that some have noticed in the whale population because of certain wind exploration and energy. Do you know anything about that? And what would you tell folks to be on the lookout for?
I do, but I would frame this as, people say like we want good environment. I would say like we want a good human environment, right? So we want an environment where we can enjoy wildlife, we can breathe clean air, we can have clean water, but we can also have farms and factories and everything else. You need to think about humans. We're a holistic animal. So just like a beaver needs a dam, we need industry. Just like a bird needs a nest, we need factories. So I don't think of environment in terms of, there's like the ocean and then there's factories. I think of it as all our environment and it all matters. And we all want it to be oriented in a way that's good for us. So from that perspective, the number one problem with so-called green energy, solar and wind, and so let's take wind, is that it's not very good at producing reliable energy at a low cost. So what's happened is people have ignored that, which is the root problem with it. And then they've also ignored some of its potential hazards to other things we might care about, such as ocean life. For me, the main thing is that it's not very good at energy, though, because with ocean life, you can do other things. So, for example, you could move the wind turbines to a different place. The problem is these are not very good sources of energy yet. And I wish them the best, but the problem they have is they're not reliable. So they're relying on uncontrollable intermittent weather patterns versus a stored source of energy, which say fossil fuels and nuclear do. So I think we should look carefully at all the impacts, positive and negative, of every technology, but I wouldn't endorse just sort of jumping on wind and jumping on this whale thing and acting like, wind is bad, we should hate wind. It's more like we want what we should call the best of the above. We want the best energy for different kinds of situations, and we should let wind and solar compete as long as they follow the same rules as everyone else. But we need to recognize they're nowhere near as good as fossil fuels yet, and we definitely shouldn't force them on anyone.
You're right. And, propping them up through government subsidy probably isn't the best way to go about it. And again, I think it's an important conversation that Americans need to reckon with. And there's so much of the green and the climate change folks out there that really muddy the waters in all of this, and the average person has a hard time understanding it, and they fall into the emotional ploys, and they don't look at the facts, and they don't look at the things that you're talking about, and they don't look at real life. They don't look at reality. They live in this idealistic bubble, and it's so great for people like you who can really explain it in a way that people can understand. I know you've got several books. I've got several of them in my bookcase at home. I think that you're excellent at what you do. Where can people go to learn more from you so they can be armed and equipped with the facts to shoot down some of this apocalyptic climate change discussion?
So they can just go to my Substack, alexepstein.substack.com, and then we have a database called energytalkingpoints.com. And the goal of that is to make it really easy for Americans to understand the truth about energy and to share it with others. So I appreciate the opportunity you always give me. And I think if people see those resources, they'll see it's not as hard as you think to think about these issues and to talk about them.
You're right. And it's so important. And it's more important than, the average person even realizes. Alex, thank you as always. You've been a longtime friend of the show and all of my endeavors. And I always rely on you for this information because you do it better than anybody else, whether you're in front of Congress or you're sitting on a podcast. We really appreciate it. God bless you. And I hope everyone checks out not only your books, but your Substack for all the more important information they need to know. Thank you again. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Tomi.
All right, folks, I hope that you are now better equipped to have these discussions, especially with the young people in your life. We know Gen Z cares so much about climate change. Well, they might not have all the facts and they might not have a true understanding of how these things actually impact livelihoods and even Mother Earth. So I hope that you will check out everything that Alex does, because he's fantastic on this and he makes it really easy to understand. Arm yourself with the information. And thank you for watching this special deep dive energy episode of Tomi Lahren is Fearless. You can always catch us Monday through Friday live, 1 p.m. Eastern. Please check out our YouTube channel at Tomi Lahren is Fearless. You can also find us on Fox Nation. From Nashville, God bless and take care. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want more of my hottest takes, must-see conversations, and of course, my final thoughts, click here and make sure you subscribe here so you never miss a beat. I'll be here every weekday and I hope you'll join me.